Have you ever wondered what you could do to give your children the best chance of living to their fullest potential? On today's episode, I bring on a clinical psychiatrist and I ask him questions such as, what can we do to give our children the best chance to live their most promising potential? How can we reduce the potential for trauma in a child's life? And then we get into how to understand and get to know your subconscious mind and all the thoughts that are running through your head all day, every day, without you even realizing them. And lastly, I asked Dr. Verny how to better integrate the shadow self, which was a concept developed by Carl Jung. This is a really exciting episode, and I hope you enjoy it. Are you looking to get thicker, fuller, and stronger hair? Then make sure to check out fullyvital.com. We've come up with great natural products to not only delay and reverse gray hairs, but also to give you the thicker, fuller hair that you deserve. So make sure to check out fullyvital.com and use the code anti-aging-hacks for 15% off your order. Are you enjoying the episodes on this channel? Then please make sure to hit the subscribe button down below so you can get notified when we release new episodes. Our goal with this channel is to give you practical tips that help you slow down and reverse your aging so you can look younger and live your best life. With that said, let's get right into the episode. Hello and welcome back to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Thomas Verny, who is a return guest, and he is a clinical psychiatrist, academic, and author of 8 books and 47 scientific papers, including The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, which was published in 27 countries. He has participated in more than 250 newspaper, radio, and TV interviews, including appearances with Donahue, Merv Griffin, Oprah, Barbara Walters, and Unsolved Mysteries. These interviews are available at thomasrvernymd.com. He has taught at Harvard University, University of Toronto, York University, and St. Mary's University of Minnesota. Dr. Verny lives with his wife in Ontario, Canada, just outside Toronto, actually. His newest book is called The Embodied Mind, and it explores our body's ability to store memories in our cells, which is a fascinating topic, and we delved deep into that in the last podcast, which I highly recommend you check out with Dr. Verny. On this show, we've got some very interesting topics for him. But with that said, Dr. Verny, welcome back to the Anti-Aging Hacks Show.
Thank you, Faraz. It's a pleasure.
We have, you've come on my show before, I've come on your show, and it's such a pleasure to have you back on because you're such a wealth of knowledge. And the more I dig into the work that you've done over your productive life, it's really fascinating how much topics you've covered in the field of psychiatry and the prenatal space as well, and recently with the embodied mind and how your cells are storing memories. So very, very fascinating. I have many, many questions for you. And so briefly, I think you gave your background in the last interview, but for folks that don't know you, please, real quick, tell us your background, how you came into psychiatry, and all the learnings and cool things you've done since you came in.
Boy, that's a big subject. Well, let me just say how I came into the prenatal area, because if you start with my birth, it will take 3 hours to
Sure.
answer that one question. So the way I got into the whole area of prenatal psychology, which by the way, did not exist at that time.
Mhm.
I was very interested in dreams. Since childhood, I was very, very interested in dreams. And so in my psychiatric practice, I would also always inquire of my patients whether they had any dreams and what they were, and then we would look into that. So one day when I was working with a young man, in the midst of his telling me his dream, he started crying like a little baby. And I did not interfere with that. And after about 10 minutes, he came out of it, so to speak. And I asked him what had happened. And he said that he found himself in a baby crib. He was a baby. He was very, very small, and he was crying for his mother. And then he sort of stopped and said, you know, there's something strange about this experience that I've just had, because I found myself in a white crib. And I've actually seen pictures, photographs of myself in a blue crib. So I said, well, go home, talk to your mother, see what she says. He came back next week, and he told me that his mother was totally amazed, because it seems that the first 3 months of his life, his parents did not have enough money to buy him a crib. And so they borrowed a crib from a neighbor, which was white.
Mm.
And only after 3 months did they buy him his very own crib, which, being a boy, it was blue. And
Mm.
that's where all the pictures were taken.
Wow.
So I listened to that, I listened to that, but I was too well educated, like you have mentioned. I went to Harvard, I went to University of Toronto. We were always taught the children can't remember anything before the age of 2. So I just put it on a shelf and forgot about it. Well, not quite, but more or less.
Mhm.
And then a few months later, I listened to a radio interview of a very famous orchestra leader in Canada. His first name was Boris. And he was, at the end of the interview, he was asked, well, Boris, where do you think your musical career started? And he said, in my mother's womb. And everybody kind of, you could hear the people sort of, although this was a radio, you could kind of hear the surprise of everybody. And they said, what do you mean? Like this was 1976, 1977, like a long time ago.
Mhm.
And he said, well, it seems that when I was just starting to conduct, every once in a while there was a score that before I even changed the page, the cello lines kind of stood out for me. Like I knew what the next few notes would be, although I had never studied that. This was my very first time. So I went home to my mother, Boris said, and I asked her about that. And she said, well, what were the particular orchestral pieces that seemed familiar to you? And he told her, and she said, those were the very pieces that I practiced when I was pregnant with you.
Mm. Wow.
So, so I heard those two stories and I started to pay attention to similar things. And then more and more things like that happened during the following year. Um, and so then one day, uh, you have to be lucky also. You have to work hard, you have to be smart, and you have to be lucky.
Hmm.
And so my luck, as it happened, was I was speaking to a very famous obstetrician in Canada, and I told him about some of these incidents. And he shook his head, but he said, there is a psychosomatic obstetrics and gynecology convention which meets every 4 years. And this year it's going to be in Rome. Why did you submit a paper on this to the convention, to the conference? And so I did. I was a totally unknown psychiatrist at the time, and I didn't think I had a chance, but my paper was accepted.
Hmm.
Not only was it accepted, but it was put on the best morning program that they had at that
Wow.
conference. And there were 500 people there from every corner of the world, including some very, very well-known people like Ronnie Lang, a very famous uh, English psychiatrist, many, many other people whose names I have forgotten. So anyway, I was very lucky to be on that program. And I had 20 minutes, and I called it the psychic life of the unborn child.
Mm.
And after about 50 minutes, I could feel electricity, sort of energy coming from the people who were watching, like they were really excited by what I was saying. And so at the end of my talk, I said, if anybody wants to continue uh, talking about this, come to my room at 5 o'clock. And at 5 o'clock, there was this huge lineup of
Wow.
people trying to come and see me. And
Wow.
so I met some of these wonderful, well-known scientists from all over the world. And when I got home, I had their names and addresses, and I started corresponding with them. And that's when I started writing what later became, by Simon and Schuster, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. So that took about 2 years to write. And Simon and Schuster then, at that time, publishers had lots of money. which they don't have today, or at least that's what they tell you. And, and so they sent me on a cross-country publicity tour. And so, every day I was in a different city. I was on television, I was on radio, some of the things that you mentioned, like Donahue. And the book became like a huge, huge success. And then as a result of the book, then I started the pre and perinatal. Well, at that time it was called the Pre and Perinatal Psychology Association of North America, PANA, which later then became APA. And I became the first president. And 2 years later, I started the journal. And in Denver last year, we just celebrated 40 years of the association. So
congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great.
And just to put the final touch on it, if I may, to bring us into the present. What was very obvious to me when I wrote the book in 1982, I think, 81 or 82, was that I could prove I had good scientific backing for saying that from the end of the second trimester, in other words, 6 months after conception, the baby, the unborn child, was able to lay down memories and remember in some very primitive way, but remember what was happening. But then as time went on, I had more and more experiences with people who seemed to remember things that happened to them earlier in life. And I did not have any biological, solid, scientific research to show how that is possible. And so that always kind of bothered me, because like it was this mystery, like what happens before the end of the second trimester. And then I will be very brief. And then about 9 years ago, I was reading up in one of the scientific journals about a 44-year-old Frenchman who went to his doctor complaining of weakness in his left leg. And when he had like a total examination and they did an X-ray of his skull, they found that he had just a thin crust of brain tissue and no brain at all. His head was filled with cerebrovascular fluid, which is called hydrocephalus, water on the brain. And yet this man was employed in the civil service, in the French civil service. He was the father of 2 children. And for all intents and purposes, he was a fully functioning human being. And so I said to myself, how is that possible? How can a person think and behave normally with practically no brain? And so that set me then on the quest to what eventually led to the embodied mind.
Wow. The little things you find in life that take you on a journey, right?
Exactly.
You can never pre-plan your life. It just happens as it does.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Got it. So I want to ask you about certain things with children.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that, and I'm just coming from a trauma base, from how to allow kids to have the best future possible and how not to have these stories that run in our heads of how we are limited in whatever way that we are. And so the question for you would be, if there are parents that are about to conceive or looking to conceive or get pregnant or have children, grow the families, what can they do before the child is even born to maximize the child's potential, to minimize the stressors on it, to minimize the trauma that it can pick up unbeknownst to itself, and as a result, struggle on later on in life? So what are the perfect conditions for a child to be born?
I think that we should drop the word perfect, because nothing we can do will ever be perfect.
Sure.
So let's call it ideal. Yeah. Because I mean, I have noticed over the many years that I have practiced psychiatry, and I still do a little bit, that people who sort of reach out for perfection will always be unhappy, because it is an ideal that you cannot reach. So let's try to do it as well as we can under the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I have learned over the last 10 years or so, and especially since I became involved with cellular intelligence, is the fact that everything that happens to you and your parents and your grandparents going back, way back, has some effect on you. So in terms of, obviously you can't do anything about your parents. Like, let's say that you and your wife want to have children. There's nothing you can do anymore about the genetics that you have inherited, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can still do a lot in terms of pre-planning before you even conceive. And I would say very simply that you have to watch your diet, nutrition, and this is, an area that you know a great deal about. So you have to watch your nutrition. You have to watch what you put into your system. Smoking, even marijuana, is not good. Obviously, drugs are not good. So in terms of what you put into your body, you have to be very careful because that is going to affect the baby. Also mentally, emotionally. Try to reach a level of low stress or no stress if possible. When you do go about conceiving a child, when you do have sexual relations, it should always be done consciously and with love. There's a huge difference between children that are conceived in love and children that are conceived under less positive circumstances. It has an effect on them. So I think, simply those two things are very important. Conceive in love and prenatally live a healthy life emotionally and nutritionally.
Mm-hmm.
During pregnancy, you have to remember that what you have inside, although it's tiny, tiny, small, sometimes even just a few cells, is a future living being. And it has to be treated as a living being with, again, love, affection. Prenatal bonding is very, very important. Prenatal communication is very important. Let me tell you a little story. I was being interviewed by a journalist, and she said, during my first pregnancy, my husband was an intern. He was studying medicine. He was hardly ever home. During my second pregnancy, 4 years later, he graduated. He was home in the evening, and every night he spoke to my unborn child. And I said, well, what would he say? And she said, well, he just talked about the weather and what we had for dinner. And then he would always end his conversations by saying, good night, Junior. Talk to you tomorrow. When this child was born, my husband, she said, walked into the delivery room and he approached me and my baby that was resting on my chest. And he said, hi, Junior. And my little son just looked at him, gave him this beautiful smile of recognition. And there was no doubt in anybody's mind that that child was happy to see my husband.
Mm.
And what is also important, just one more thing, what is also important is that the relationship between this son and my first son and my husband is so different, is so much better than between the first son who did not bond with my husband prenatally and the one that bonded. So there's lots and lots of research to show the importance of prenatal communication and prenatal bonding.
That is very powerful. Thank you for sharing those stories. It just goes to show how careful we have to be around this topic of conception in children and how
Yes,
sensitive children are to pick up everything, nuances,
very.
tone, right?
Yes.
Um,
And it's the same, by the way, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just want to add to it. It's the same with animals. It's the same with dogs, for example, who are incredibly sensitive to your moods. So imagine how much more sensitive a child would be.
mhm. Wow. Okay. Okay, so now let me come to my second question, which is the child is now born, is in the world. And from what I understand, the first few years, up to 7 years of the child, they're in theta brainwave state, which means they're basically absorbing the whole world, no questions asked, taking everything in. So they don't understand sarcasm, they don't understand criticism,
No,
they
that's
think it's
right.
personal, right? So what can we do in those super early formative years, 7 to 10 years, let's say, of their birth, after birth, to make them the ideal version of themselves so they can prosper and live their best life?
Yes, very good question. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that love and respect is very important. Um, if you and your husband or wife and husband, whatever, if, for example, they have an argument, which happens in the best of families, it's very important, and the child can hear it. It's very important to explain to the child that this is not about you. We adults, parents, you're having some differences, but we love you. Both of us love you. The husband should say that, the wife should say that. Um, so it's very important to not use, as you have mentioned, sarcasm and criticism. Even at the moment of birth, it's very important not to make some stupid remark like, look, what's wrong with her head, or something like that. Or, gee, she has no hair, or whatever.
Yeah.
Those are those are messages that the child is going to remember forever, forever.
Yeah.
And, when you talk about limiting sort of um, limiting concepts that people carry with them, many of those start during in utero before the child is born and very soon after, because people don't realize that everything that is said is being tape recorded in the brain of that child. And the child may never be conscious of it, but it will still be there. It's like gravity. When
Hmm.
we are sitting on our chairs, we don't know there's gravity. We have no idea that but just try to jump up and not come down. Gravity will bring you down every time.
Yeah.
It's the same as the unconscious. And so these unconscious messages, um, there are they work like gravity, so they pull you down all the time. So it's very important not to be critical, not to say things that are hurtful. And a lot of people have this idea, but well, what does the kid the kid doesn't even understand what I'm talking about, so I can say whatever I like.
Yeah.
Not true, not true. And even if you say it in a different language, let's say that, you're multilingual, and a lot of parents who are multilingual believe that if they speak, I don't know, in German or Hungarian or whatever it is, uh, that the child is not going to understand it. The children, again, just like animals, they pick up the energy, they pick up the tone. Just like if you can say to a dog, sit down, the dog is not going to sit down. But if you say, sit, it will sit.
Yeah.
And it's the same with children. So how you phrase it, how you talk, uh, the vocabulary you use, all those things are very important. And speaking of talking, the more you talk to your children, the better. Every IQ test shows that children who have been spoken to a lot develop their cognitive processes much more than children who are not.
Mm.
And if you have differences, explain why. If the child, for example, is throwing food at you, okay, the 6 months old child is throwing food at the mother, it's very important. It's very important not to punish the child, not to hit it, but to explain why that is not good behavior. If you go to a supermarket, you can spend about an hour watching mothers with small children, and you will find that some mothers will tug at children or yell at them, stop that, don't do that. And others will stop, explain what is wrong, and then gradually move on. Huge difference in the
Mm.
long run, how those two different children will develop differently. So
Wow.
it's very important. It's very important not to yell, not to hit, but to explain. And then watch their innate abilities. Like some children will show interest in music. Other children will show interest in listening to stories. I, for example, was very interested in fairy tales when I was very small.
Mm.
And my grandmother would always, when I spent time with her, would read me Grimm's fairy tales. And I just loved that, and I still do. So, watch sort of your child for special gifts and then try to support that.
Mm. Got it. Okay. Thank you. Those are a very exhaustive list of what you can do to help bloom or help your child bloom, really. I guess the two questions I have, and this is maybe not the outliers anymore, at least one of them is not, but two conditions that come up. One, in certain cultures, parents use physical force on the child, they discipline the child and they say it's okay. In the culture that I come from, I think back in the day, they used to say, you have a teacher as a child, you have a teacher, and the teacher owns the flesh, the parents own the bone. So don't break a bone, but you can cut the flesh if you have to discipline a child. So that's one thing, which is physical, I don't want to say abuse, but physical discipline. And then the second item that is very rampant now, at least in the West and growing everywhere, is divorce. And preceding a divorce, there's altercations, fights, arguments, all the things that come with uh, what for a child would be very traumatic, right? And then the actual separation and how the child maybe thinks of that as an abandonment or whatever the
Yes,
child comes up with as a
yes,
coping
yes,
mechanism.
yes.
So what can we do in these instances? The physical disciplining, but also the divorce issue that's so rampant now.
In terms of physical, if you are physical with your child, that child is going to grow up to be physical with anybody that he or she disagrees with.
Mm.
So you are really playing into a violent future for that child. Uh, most most of us automatically repeat with our children and with our environment what we learned at the knees of our parents, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
It's automatic. It takes a lot of therapy and or kind of insightful mind, introspective mind to shake off what you learned from your parents and to become your own person.
Hmm.
So most people don't get over that. So violence begets violence. And so keep that in mind. I don't think I need to say any more.
Sure.
No violence. Secondly, what about divorce? Like I said at the beginning, you have to explain to the child that it's not about them, but the child is going to suffer no matter what you do. Um, I think it would be very important for the parents to try to amicably separate. Um, once once that is done, for the child to spend time both with mother and father, equal time, if possible, if possible. Um, Not to remarry too soon, because that, in a sense, puts the child into a very difficult position. Who am I going to be loyal to? My stepdad or my actual father?
Hmm.
Also, never ever speak negatively about your spouse who's not present.
Yeah.
And that's difficult. I know it's difficult. Uh, I went through a divorce. I know from firsthand how difficult that is. But in terms of ideal, that is the ideal you should strive for. And if you do say something negative, catch yourself at it, at least, listening to this, hopefully you will remember, and you catch yourself and you say to the child, well, that's just, my problem with your dad, but that's not your problem. He loves you. He's a great guy. We did not agree on everything, but this is how things are. So, not to say anything negative about the other parent is very important, and not to marry or start going out with other partners too soon. Give the child, I would say, at least a couple of years to find his or her footing,
Mhm.
to get used to the separation, and then the child can see that life continues and things have not fallen apart and he's not abandoned, as you said, and then perhaps a new person could come into the picture.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for that. Now I want to get to a very important question that I've recently started noticing. This pattern around people as I'm getting more conscious of the thoughts that are running around in my head and trying to overcome the limitations I've placed on myself. I look around to friends that I have and I go, why don't you do this a different way? Why don't you go for this? Why don't you increase or try to grow in this aspect of your life or your relationships? And I've come to realize, Dr. Verny, and this is just something that I am realizing, is that people are walking around with a cloud of, I don't know, dark cloud around them. It's like over their head, but it's around them and they can't see it. They're stuck in their limitations and they argue for their limitations of why I cannot do this or I cannot do that. And that's the program that they're inherited or whatever it is, it's developed over the time. But it seems like they're prisoners of that program and they cannot break out of it, or most of them won't even try to. Some can, but it seems to be the norm. The more I look around at my friends, there's repeating patterns with them over and over, and that's what they do. And I've realized that maybe or I'm sure I've got a pattern around me as much as I'm trying to change myself. So the question to you is, how do people develop this limited beliefs and these limited patterns, and they can't even see what they cannot see, right? They're inside the jar, so they can't see the label on the outside of the jar. And so, how does this happen, and what can we do to get out of it?
Well, um, perhaps a good example would be yourself, if I may. You said that you have noticed that some of your friends have this cloud over their heads. I think at one time there was a comic called Little Orphan Annie, and she was often described as having a cloud over her head. Um, so you noticed that. You noticed that in your friends, right? So what enabled you to notice that and they did not notice it? What do you think?
Well, I'm not in their shoes, so I can be an impartial observer and see
Yeah.
them repeat the things over and over.
So if you tell them, if you say to one of your friends, you seem to have this overarching idea that you can that you're not a born writer, let's say, okay?
Mhm.
So I've read your poetry, let's say, you could say, right? I've read your poetry. I think it's very good. And they say, no, 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 it's shit. It's no good at all.
Yeah.
Well, that's a limiting belief system, right? Then and there. So you notice it. So there's something in you that is kind of an inquiring mind, okay? There's something in you that you observe and you try to make sense of it. They don't seem to have that when it comes to their own limiting belief systems. So somehow you have to show them or show it to yourself, or we'll talk about this later. Um, that this limiting belief system is exactly what the words say. It's limiting. So how can you persuade them to start looking at that? So it like in in you well, if you go into Freudian sort of Freudian analysis and Freudian type of thinking of the mind, Freud very wisely established what he called the unconscious. And so a lot of the things that really move us is in the unconscious. And Carl Jung, uh, who was a colleague of Freud's, but having had a father who was a clergyman and a grandfather who was a clergyman, uh, went sort of a much more sort of spiritual way than Freud. Um, and so he started talking about archetypes and the collective unconscious instead of just the personal unconscious. And that's when he came up with the idea of the shadow. And there's much debate in Jungian circles about what actually the shadow is. But the shadow, essentially, the way I see it, is all the things that somehow you don't want to see about yourself.
Mhm.
Somehow, for some reason, you have pushed it underground, so to speak. And it's not just bad things, it's also good things. This is the important part.
Mm.
That's where I sort of disagree with Jung. And I have found that that seems to apply to a lot of people. Um, so there might be in your shadow also, for example, um, a desire, ambition, for example, a desire to be famous, but you have been brought up in a family where somehow that is considered like selfish,
Mhm.
or I don't know, some negative. And so you have pushed it underground, but it's still there. And so a lot of the energy, which would be sort of configurated in that complex about wanting to be famous and wanting to be ambition, all that energy is sort of, it's like atomic energy that is just contained in the nucleus of the atom. And you have to find a way of letting it out. And then all that energy, you have to own it. You have to, the way to get into the unconscious is to own those repressed parts of yourself. So when you can say to yourself, yeah, I recognize that I'm ambitious, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as I don't do A, B, and C, whatever. As long as I don't harm people on the way to become president of the United States, that is fine. So trying to get in touch with the shadow, or sort of unlock the shadow and let out the good and the bad, admit that there are some aggressive instincts in there, that sometimes you feel just right, you really would like to hit that person who has insulted you, right?
Mhm.
uh, but you don't. And then you go home and you have stomach aches and you're vomiting and you are sweating and you are unhappy. And that's when you have to ask yourself, what is it that has happened here? Or you have to go into therapy, or you have to have some very good friends who can point out these things to you. Or you observe it yourself. Like, different people have different ways. There's no sort of one trick that works for everybody.
Mhm.
Um, but the important thing is to realize that there are things in your unconscious which are good and bad, but you have to get to know them. So, like, uh, there's a wonderful book which I just love. Um, it's it's Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales.
Mm.
Uh, and it was written by Marie-Louise von Franz. And because I told you that I'm interested in fairy tales, because fairy tales in many ways really talk about the unconscious. And
Yeah.
so, when you have Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf and the hunter and all those kinds of things, and you have the you have the witch or the fairy, things like that. They all have to do with the unconscious, the good parts, the bad parts. They have to do. So I don't know whether I've answered your question because it's a very complex issue. But
Let,
the important thing is
yeah.
that it's like an Achilles heel. It's a weakness in you, and you have to somehow contact it and let the energy out so that it can serve you instead of really limit you.
Yeah. I love this. It also shows up or manifests itself in the nice guy syndrome where you want to
Oh
hide,
God, yes,
right? Hide the aggressive parts of you and just get along, play along so
yes,
you can fit in with the crowd. But I think people can sense that and
yes.
they get pushed away from that
They get
energy.
put, they get revolted by it.
Right.
But if you just look at religions, for example, in Catholicism, you have the confessional. That's a
Mm,
great idea. It's a
mm,
great idea, except that it just releases a little bit of the guilt, but it does not prevent you next week to do the same thing that
right.
you confess today.
Right.
So, that does not work very well. Scapegoating is what a lot of people do. So instead of contacting and admitting and absorbing their own negativity, they will put it on somebody else. So it's not my fault, you made me do this. Okay. You are, I don't know, fixing the roof, and your wife says there's a telephone call, and suddenly you lose your footing and you fall, and you say, you made me do it. Well, she didn't make you do it.
Right.
You just reacted in that way. It's, you have to own it. You have to
Mhm.
own it. That's the word. Yeah.
So the follow-on question for you would be, how is it, what are some practical ways that you can get into, first of all, you have to be aware and
Yes.
know that you have a shadow, right? All of us
Right.
do.
That's where we
That's
start.
right. That's where we start. First is acknowledgement, awareness. Number two, let's say now you want to take tentative steps to connect with this energy, to talk to it, to make it your friend, to integrate it fully into your life so you become whole and you're not two separate parts. How is that process practically done in simple steps, maybe?
Yeah. Well, practically, first of all, like you said, become aware of the fact that you have a shadow. All of us have a shadow.
Mhm.
Um, then observe when you overreact, or somebody tells you you overreacted. When you overreact, when you get too upset about something that somebody said to you, that there is a good chance that it's the shadow talking.
Mm.
Um, whether you cry or yell, or whether somehow you have to smoke up, or whatever it is that you do to relieve stress, observe that, be honest with yourself, and say, that is not right. There's something going on here that is not, it's not Faraz Khan who have made me upset.
Right.
So it's very important not to blame others, not to scapegoat people. I mean, right now in the United States, but all over the world, there's an incredible amount of scapegoating going on. Uh, and so groups of people are set apart, and it's their fault that things are, like immigrants, for example, in the United States right now, huge discussions about people coming through the border, all that kind of stuff. So there is an incredible amount of scapegoating going on, and that is also part of the shadow. It's the shadow of that group because there's a collective shadow, and then there's a personal shadow. So again, being practical, like you said, notice when you are overreacting. Uh, Notice when you are um, telling people off, when you get insulted. Uh, Notice when somebody says something that makes you feel badly about yourself. Uh, Notice things when people say good things about you and you try to erase that.
Mm,
Okay, like the example that I gave you about, I like your poetry. No, 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 it's nothing. That is also your shadow. Um, when I was young, I was in a school choir, and the teacher said to me, um, just open your mouth, don't sing. You have a, what do they call it when you have a bad ear? Um,
mm,
when you don't
yeah.
pick up the tones,
Oh,
whatever.
yeah.
There's an expression.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, you can't sing. Just open your mouth as if you were singing. From that moment on, I never sang for
Right.
years and years and years. That one remark was enough to put that energy about singing and wanting to have fun right down into my unconscious. So
Mm.
be on the watch for those kinds of things, what people have said to you, and try to remember how that sort of coincides with the limits that you have put on yourself.
Beautiful, beautiful. I think that the more aware that you become with yourself and how you react or things that have happened, you think about and you ponder about them, you will notice in the past 2 years, Dr. Verny, I have come so far in my consciousness journey that I am now becoming so much more aware of my mannerisms and how I behave and how certain things shaped who I was. So I'm excited to keep going. The one thing I wanted to bring up is I read this
Yeah,
book called, I think, Living Untethered by Michael Singer. And it's a book where he talks about anything that comes up in your life that causes a reaction, that
yes,
causes you to feel
yes,
anything,
yes,
positive, negative,
yes.
is a sanskara, is something that's stuck in you. And
Yeah,
so if you can just let it go, just let it go, let it go. So nothing reacts with you anymore. The world is happening out there,
I
but it's
don't
not
agree with
affecting you.
that. I don't agree with that.
Okay,
Okay, let me say right away,
sure.
let it go is nonsense, because you can't let it go. Because if you don't know what you're letting go,
Hmm,
how can you let go of it?
I
Uh,
see.
right?
Hmm.
So, that's like saying to someone as if they did not have an unconscious, as if it was all in the conscious mind. Uh,
Hmm,
let's say, um, I have met some kids who would be embarrassed about their looks. I can't say, let it go, you look fine. That's not going to make a
true.
difference,
100%. Yeah.
right?
100%. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's much wiser to say to yourself, I agree with the first part, notice your reactions, which we have been talking about.
Mhm.
Notice your reaction, and then you ask yourself in a quiet moment, uh, what's going on here? Why am I reacting like that? Now, another thing which I did not mention, which is very, very useful, is to keep a diary.
Hmm.
If
Journal.
you
Yeah.
can, if you can spend 10, 15 minutes a night writing down what has happened to you during the day, what dreams you have had, what interactions you've had with people. Doesn't have to be perfect English, doesn't have to be perfect sentences.
Mhm.
Just to get your feelings down, it is incredibly healthy and healing. Because then, after a while, it forces you to think about what has happened. By writing it down, you are getting into a more real situation.
Mm.
By seeing the words in front of you, it becomes real. Whereas your thoughts are, kind of ambiguous, like they're just floating there.
Yeah.
So by writing it down, that's very, very important. If you want to really transform yourself, if you really want to get in touch with the core of you, of who you are, keeping a diary is incredibly healthy and healing.
Ah, okay. I do journal every single day, but it's more about what I want to do as opposed to what has happened and retrospection or introspection about what's going on. This is a great idea. I would
Yeah.
like to incorporate this right away.
Change that a little bit and let me
Mhm.
know in 6 months how it's going.
Totally, totally. I'm on a great journey,
Yeah.
so I want to keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about, so we talked about the unconscious and we talked
Yes.
about the shadow and the
Yes.
Jungian premise of that, and all
Yes.
of that makes sense. Then there's the concept of the thoughts that are running in our mind all day, every day. Uh, those are subconscious, which is driving those thoughts, and they're going unnoticed by us. And now I've started meditating twice a day. And when you say some positive affirmation to yourself and you come up
Hmm.
against yourself and you go, I don't
Hmm.
actually believe that positive affirmation. And
Right.
then you think about the whole day I've thought negative thoughts about myself, but I didn't even know that I was thinking negative thoughts about myself. That's the crazy part. And so there's an automatic program going on that was picked up over the lifetime. Somebody said you
Yes.
have a bad
Yes. Yeah.
voice, you can't sing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think maybe you would say journaling is also an effective strategy to kind of
Very
write down what's
effective.
going on.
Very effective. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so those are the thoughts that are going on. We talked about the things that are interacting with you or causing you to feel positively or negatively. Those are great learning points for you to kind of understand what's going on in the world and how you're reacting. And then the third one is the Jung would call
Yes.
the unconscious connect with that. So
Yes.
there's a lot in here for you to kind of get to know yourself and get to the depths of who you really are. Okay. The fourth point that I wanted to bring up is the traumas that have been inflicted, supposedly inflicted on us or inflicted by us to ourselves, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of trauma in the world, and like I think you would agree, or you would even say that even small things that, again, a silly remark that a teacher made to you, it just kind of messed up your singing career,
Yeah.
so to speak,
Absolutely.
right? And so just the littlest things can have such a huge impact in a child or even an adult's life. And
Yes.
so when you've got traumas, either capital T, meaning big traumas, physical assaults or sexual abuse, or small trauma, somebody said something, maybe that was not so nice. Um, what, what's the best way to get rid of these? Because this is not the shadow work, right? This is going to be
Mhm.
different.
Yeah. Well, the big traumas you usually remember,
Hmm.
unless, there are certain sexual abuses that people very often cannot cannot really face, and so it's just repressed. And sometimes it comes up at the worst possible times, or sometimes it comes up in therapy. But there are certain types of traumas that people just don't remember. So one has to be very careful in terms of bringing it into consciousness, because that can re-traumatize the person again.
Hmm.
So, um, but in terms of like if you do remember what the trauma was, I mean, let's say that we are talking about wartime trauma, okay?
Yeah.
Let's say that, we are talking about a soldier who was traumatized by whatever happened um, during the war. Um, I think that sort of there are different ways of going about it. And I think all of them have to be tried. And sometimes they have to be tried together. So individual therapy, but also group therapy works very, very well with people who have been traumatized. So, I mean, it's sort of a little bit similar to Alcoholics Anonymous, where people go and they all sort of uh, have one thing in common, which is their addiction to alcohol. So you could have like a group of traumatized soldiers, for example, talking about their traumas, and having the support of the group is very, very important. Um, Also, having um, certain experiences, like for example, in indigenous cultures, let's say North American Indian, you have like sweat lodges, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Where so there is a kind of ritualized way of getting in touch with the trauma, which can be very, very helpful. So I think, and then of course there are drugs. psychiatric drugs, which sometimes can help. Um, Hypnosis can sometimes help, taking a person slowly back to the traumatic experience. Um, and so, you know, depending on what is available in the place where the person wants to sort of heal themselves, right? Depending what is available, you should like try whatever is available in your part of the world. And if that doesn't work, then seek out more help that is provided in different ways. So what
Hmm.
I'm trying to say is that, there are multiple ways. And once again, when you're dealing with people's psyche, no one way works for everybody. So just because it worked for your friend doesn't mean it's going to work for you, nor
Hmm.
should you feel badly if it doesn't work for you, because we are all different.
Got it.
So it's the same thing with therapists, like somebody will say, oh, well, I've seen a psychiatrist and he didn't help me. Okay, well, that's, that says nothing,
Hmm.
because every psychiatrist has a different personality. Every different psychiatrists have different ways of approaching. Like I I I am the kind of psychiatrist who works with people's unconscious and goes into their family histories and their own personal histories. So it's a more introspective way. There are a lot of psychiatrists who just give out medications, see you for 10 minutes, and prescribe the medication and show you out the door. And so if you have seen one of those people and they have not helped you, it doesn't mean that somebody else, a psychologist or another psychiatrist or social worker, cannot help you. So don't give up, keep trying. You will find a way that will help you.
Why does it seemingly takes 2 milliseconds to get the trauma to you? Like something happens, right? Somebody makes a comment, somebody physically assaults you. It takes 2 seconds. Your brain takes a big snapshot of that event,
Yeah,
stores that in, and then
yeah,
replays it over and over. So it's now etched into your memory.
yeah,
And it's so unfair. If
it is.
anything is unfair, this is unfair that it takes years to peel that out of you, but it takes 2 seconds to get it inside you.
Yeah, that's because the way our brain works, that somehow negative comments, hurtful comments, whatever, are remembered much more than positive comments. It's just the way the brain works. Um, I cannot explain that, but it has been found that negative comments have a much longer duration, a much greater impact than positive ones, and that's unfortunate, but that's the way we are.
Hmm.
There is, it's just the way we are. We are much more under the influence of negative than positive. So you can tell a person 10,000 times that they are beautiful. Let's say a woman who complains that she's ugly, and you can tell her 10,000 times that she's not, and she will not believe you. You really have to start finding out why she believes that she's ugly. Where did it start? Is she comparing herself to her sister, who has always been told that she's beautiful, but this
Mm.
particular person has been told, you're not very pretty, but you are very clever.
Ah, okay. Fair. So I guess on that same note, I'll ask you one other question.
Sure.
I get the feeling there's somebody on my Twitter feed who posted something that was very interesting. The exact post was, I think most people don't love themselves. Fight me on this, right? And so it was a provocative statement, but I sat there and I pondered it for a while, and I've come to the conclusion, this is N of one, my conclusion, that maybe 5% of people that are walking around truly love themselves and 95% don't. I'd love to get your perspective and why it is the way it is.
Well, I don't think it's quite that bad. I
Okay.
don't, I don't think 95% of people don't love themselves. Um, I have no idea how many people love themselves and how many people don't. I really don't know. As a psychiatrist, obviously, I see people who have problems,
Hmm.
And so it's not a fair representation of the population at large, right?
Right.
So, but like I was saying before, negativity seems to have a greater impact on your psyche than positivity. And so I think that there are a lot of people who, I wouldn't say that they don't love themselves, but they find fault with themselves. They find all kinds of things that are not right.
Hmm.
And I wish I could A, B, or C, select whichever you like. I wish I would, you know, well, in my case, I will tell you quite honestly, my mother, for example, my father was quite tall and my mother was much smaller, and I came to be somewhere between the two of them. And whenever there would be a friend or she would see a picture of some of my friends, she would say, "Oh, Peter is such a nice tall guy.
Right.
Oh, Ivan, he's really such a kind, tall guy." Like it was really important to her that the person was tall, and
Mm.
I knew I was not tall.
Yeah.
Draw your own conclusion, right?
Yeah.
So, it made me feel small. And for a long time, I had problems with that. I had, you know, I would look at girls when I was young and starting to become interested. And I would say, oh no, they are probably looking for a tall, blonde, blue-eyed guy, and I am small and dark, and they will not like me, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And where did it start? Well, it starts in many ways, but one of the places it started was recognizing that my mother really liked tall people. And then I would assume that every other woman in the world also likes tall people.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, so now you have that in the back of your mind. It's constantly on repetition, on loop. How is it? The question would be, how do you get rid of it? And I think you've shared some techniques, but
Yeah,
I'd be curious if there are any more because this is a loop that repeats all day, every time you interact with a woman or you're around a woman,
yeah.
right?
Well, listen to what people tell you. Listen, listen. Don't just listen to the negative. Open yourself up to the positive, which I've said, about the shadow. Like there are a lot of positive things in the shadow which you have repressed, and gaining access to them and owning them is incredibly healing. So, you know, um, well, let's go back to myself, who's the person that I think I know best. Um, but when I discovered that I would not sing and I would not open my mouth like, when I was a scout, or, when I was with other men and women and they would break out into a song, I never did. And
Hmm.
I noticed that. And I started asking myself, why is that? Like I could hear people who had much worse voices than me singing at full throat. Well, how come they could do that and I couldn't do that? So
Right.
it took me back to, what this teacher said to me. And once I understood that, gradually, slowly, I tried out my voice. And also, it cut me off from music for a very long time, because
Hmm.
anything musical was painful. It reminded me of the fact that I was limited in that
Hmm.
area. So observe what's going on, observe how other people act in the same situation, and ask yourself questions about yourself. I mean, accept the fact that you have a shadow, accept the fact that you have an unconscious, that there are things in your unconscious which are like scripts in a film, and you follow it automatically, or
Yeah.
gravity, as I said before, which influences you without knowing. Getting to know what your script is, that's the important thing.
Hmm. I love how you phrase that. That is the most important thing, or one of the most important
Yeah,
things you could do to get to know yourself and then choose a new vision or a new future for you, depending on what you want to do, but
yeah.
based on your knowledge of who you really are, as opposed to the script that just drives you into whatever profession or future that you
I
end
mean,
up in.
Yeah, Socrates, a long, long time ago, the Greek philosopher Socrates said, in answer, what do you need to do with your life? Know thyself.
Right. Yep. I remember, or I've read that somewhere. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Dr. Verny, this has been such a great interview. Thank you for coming back on. Tell us where people can find you and learn more about you.
I think it's thomasrvernymd.com is my website.
Okay. And if you Google
And
Dr.
and
Thomas Verny,
one more, yeah, and
yeah.
one more thing. I'm also on Psychology Today. I have blogs on Psychology Today, and they are very easy to get to. You
Hmm.
just go to Psychology Today, blogs, Verny, Thomas R. Verny, any of those will take you to my blogs. And there are different blogs every month, and they're very interesting.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you again for coming back on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care.